Welcome to NMG Benefits. We are an award-winning and independent strategic consulting firm on employee benefits in Southern Africa. Our footprint tracks across South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, where we are trusted by employers, medical schemes, pension funds, employees, and retirees. For our unbiased, strategic, and global best practice counsel on healthcare, retirement, investments, risk insurance, and financial planning propositions and solutions. NMG Benefits is a subsidiary of NMG Group, a multinational financial advisory and intermediary services organization. This, coupled with an employee base of 450 skilled and experienced professionals across Southern Africa, allows us to leverage off our global reach with specialized expertise for local knowledge, enabling us to be a financial services leader that helps small to medium and large organizations to attract and retain talent. Our services include healthcare consulting. We are a top 3 healthcare consulting broker in South Africa. Retirement fund consulting, with assets under management of approximately 20 billion rand. Supported by the best-in-market actuarial team for customized retirements and/or risk-benefit solutions to best suit your needs and that of your fund members. Retirement fund administration. Big enough to administer your fund, small enough to deliver personal, accurate, and responsive service, always, by providing robust technology that supports efficient, accurate, and professional service levels for your fund members. Investment consulting. We advise on assets exceeding 40 billion rands and manage market-leading investment portfolios. Our investment consulting arm provides critical counsel on investment strategies, the selection of asset managers, the most appropriate investment vehicle, and ESG considerations. Actuarial services. Our actuarial services are split across healthcare and retirement funds to support the business solution capabilities. Personal financial services. We provide tailor-made solutions to employees to meet the needs and requirements of particular individuals. Short-term insurance. Our packaged products and services for affinity trade, commercial and professional groups or sectors also have an innovative product line that has delivered immense value for our clients. The NMG Smart Fund is a multi-employer umbrella retirement fund. NMG Smart Alec, powered by FinEasy, is an easy-to-use platform that uses artificial intelligence to provide financial literacy to members across all segments. The NMG Benefits Diagnostic Tool measures an employer's employee benefits health across healthcare, retirement funds, and people, including wellness. NMG Smart Aid allows members to invest in a retirement annuity separately from their pension or provident fund to enable them to save towards a healthier quality of life. Our core purpose of finding a better way has been recognized in the industry, having won several sought-after professional management review awards over the past few years, including the prestigious PMR Diamond Arrow Award. We are member-focused, and our mission is to give the best advice to every member based on their circumstances. Get in touch with NMG Benefits for tailored, best-in-market employee benefits proposition for your organization, fund, or union. NMG, finding a better way. The NMG South African group of companies are authorized financial service providers, trading as NMG Benefits.
Molweni, Dumelang, Ndimacheloni, Absheni, Sanbonani, Lochani, Goeiemorgen, a very good morning and a warm welcome to NMG's Smart Retirement Seminar 2021, held under the theme Elephants in the Room. My name is Nzinga Kunda, and it's a great pleasure to be your program director today as we unpack issues around retirement, environmental, social governance, investing, and more. It's so nice to see actual faces in the room as well as connect with you on hybrid. I'd like to ask Craig Shadrawi, who is the head of retirement at NMG, to make his way to the stage to give us some context and welcome us to the event.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first annual retirement seminar. Welcome esteemed guests, keynote speakers. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first annual retirement seminar. Welcome esteemed guests, keynote speakers, and our lovely MC Nzika, if I got it right. Thank you for giving up some of your time. I know this time of the year is very hectic. Everybody's trying to work towards call it a end of year, and I think everybody's suffering from fatigue. But it's so nice to see some people in a room to interact in a room as opposed to a virtual scenario. For those on the virtual side, thank you for joining us. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome, a special welcome to Sipamandla Buthelezi, who heads up our platform business, started on the 1st of November. Welcome, SPA. Welcome to the NMG family, and the team are really looking forward to working with you. Our core purpose is finding a better way for our clients, whether it's our employers, our trustees, and our management committees, with the ultimate goal of providing best advice to our members and putting our member first. So this retirement seminar is really focused about unpacking the retirement fund landscape with real topical issues that members really need to understand. And with Alex and team, we're really looking forward to your discussion and getting to the meaty parts of some real topical issues. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over excuse me, to our MC and enjoy the function.
Thanks so much, Craig, for that succinct introduction and setting the scene for us. We know that there are some topical issues that are going to be discussed today. Who best to do this than our keynote speaker, who will be looking at the role of a private retirement system and social security in South Africa. An adjunct professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, Alex van den Heever will be grappling with difficult issues, and I've been told there's no censorship, and he'll be speaking truth to power. A warm round of applause for him, please, as he makes his way to the stage.
Okay, good morning. So the talk is really to look at, I think, some of the issues around essentially the proposals for a social security reform in South Africa that have implications for the incumbent systems that exist in South Africa. And everybody would be aware of the green paper that was presented, that was released by the Department of Social Development and then withdrawn. And that in itself is an indication of certain problems, I would argue, within governance in South Africa, the way in which policy is being made, and how the conversation on kind of very key reforms in South Africa are occurring. This has also happened within the medical schemes environment, and in many respects, we've faced a situation where for sort of roughly 20 years, South Africa has actually not invested in any kind of structural reform in key parts of its social security system. So I'm going to run through what would be some of the proposals for discussion, but I think that what I'd be wanting to indicate and clarify is why the proposals would be considered in the first place, what problems they're trying to solve. And it can be seen that many reforms sort of look like zero-sum game proposals, where the only way in which something is implemented by government is to take something away from some other part of the system. And that is a problem in how some people present policy reforms in South Africa. And it, for instance, has, in my view, distorted some discussions, let's say, in healthcare reform, where sort of one-size-fits-all proposals are put in a very sort of absolutist sense on the table, and there's no real discussion or evolution of the proposals. In social security reform, it might look or even sound the same, but is in fact quite different as a policy process. And maybe to start off with is social security systems are pretty conventional policies and institutional frameworks in most countries in the world. The difference in the case of South Africa is we've essentially not invested in a social security system since the pre-apartheid period right up until now. And sometimes there is a view that people have. They talk about, well, you know, they're welfare states or there's welfarism, and you know, you can't afford that unless your economy has really grown substantially, et cetera, et cetera. We can't be Sweden tomorrow. And those are pretty naive discussions, and they really come from a point of departure, I would argue, in the sort of South African context, where we really haven't actually experienced a deeper system. And I am going to go through this as a set of systems problems, because that's really what we're facing. South Africa, in the pre-94 period, did not invest in a social security system, either on the health side or on retirement, death, disability, unemployment, etc., because it was essentially a a society that was designed for the protection of whites alone. And within that context, you are actually largely secure as a white person in South Africa in getting employment, and therefore conventional employee benefits were pretty sufficient to deal with most cases of social security. You didn't need a wider or deeper system. So you have unemployment insurance, because that also, it's a very narrow program that we have in South Africa, but it provides protection only for people who've historically been employed and only for a period of up to 12 months. It's an incredibly limited scheme, but it was satisfactory for people who weren't going to experience unemployment for very long. We had rudimentary social assistance programs that were implemented in the apartheid period, differentiated according to race. And so we have these very underdeveloped systems because, in fact, you didn't have to worry about the total population. But in real countries around the world, you have to. And you design what are referred to as comprehensive social security systems, which are not one-size-fits-all systems. They are by no means NHI proposals or ESCOMs that are designed for social protection. They involve a multiplicity of schemes for people in different positions in society and in life. Some people need more income support, some people need insurance. And the obligation that is essentially placed on government in a country like South Africa is to actually set up institutional frameworks that give people access to this protection. So I'm giving a bit of a preamble before I run through, I think, some of the institutional issues, but, and I might not get through all of them, but I think it's important just to get the sort of initial context that, in fact, we have different needs, all of us, during different parts of our life cycle. You're selling employee benefits, you know that aspect. But when you're looking at society as a whole, you've got people who lack income for a number of reasons. You have people who, during critical periods of their lives, are in danger, can't support their children properly, and those people effectively need transfers from government, redistributive programs, what are referred to as non-contributory schemes. Insurance doesn't help those people. And the lower your income goes, the less insurance helps you. And we have in South Africa, and I'm going to be pretty rude about our system, not the players and the incumbents and what people do, but what we have as a system can't support many people, even who earn adequate incomes in South Africa, in many ways. There are just too many cracks in the system. And the way in which South Africa has typically approached it from the pre-apartheid period to the post-apartheid period is to say, well, we think contributory protection for retirement, death, disability, etc., is best served from a government intervention perspective by creating tax subsidies. I mean, it's an incredibly naive approach. It certainly is very good and lucrative for an industry because it channels people into particular financial products and services. And there's nowhere else to go. And in an environment where there is inadequate competition, then on both asset management as well as on pension administration, the fees are higher than they should be. So the market doesn't work properly. So government provides an intervention through a tax subsidy, but it doesn't actually regulate the resulting competition very well. The same happens in healthcare. These are very complex systems. And the typical economics 101 arguments about competition typically don't apply. They actually don't apply in many contexts. But markets have advantages because they are decentralized. They give people choice. People can innovate and disrupt other people. You're not compelled to participate or to belong to one particular provider. But the moment you start distorting that structure in one way, you can undermine competition, you can undermine innovation, and you also can't solve problems that require different institutional mechanisms. So very often social security reforms are actually about making sure that people can pool at a wider level than would occur at an individual product level or at an individual scheme level. So pooling is often a problem. because that, accessing, in the case of pension, death and disability, the accessing group schemes is a problem for many individuals who shift employers, move into self-employment, have to access individual products rather than group products, and therefore move into an environment which is a lot more expensive and a lot less protective, and often people withdraw their savings early, all sorts of things like that, which I think everybody is pretty familiar with in South Africa. What's important to note is that this doesn't happen in other countries that have well-developed social security systems, because they do create alternatives. They do create institutional environments that give people the option to join the equivalent of a group scheme and obtain that protection regardless of whether or not they're a single self-employed individual, part of a medical practice, or whether they are part of a corporate. So in South Africa, what we've got is this big split between group scheme type options and the individual market. And in most retirement settings internationally with good, well-developed social security systems, the products we sell to people who are in the more sort of individual market would be regarded as part of a fourth tier of social protection. In other words, a largely unregulated market that tops up your basic coverage. So what we're actually giving is the tier 4 protection, which is an individualized, expensive, underwritten product to individuals, whereas that kind of protection in many environments would be offered through some kind of pooled product, often through an institutional framework set up by governments on the whole. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are government schemes, but the government is responsible for creating the institutional environment that allows somebody to be able to do that. And it does. Now, there's a further problem that gets created, and that is that it's certainly in the South African context, with such uneven distributions of income, such precarious work environments for many people, is that it's quite difficult for people to save on the bottom end of that. So many people are in an environment where their incomes are not necessarily certain, they're moving in and out. Now, a long-term savings product can be problematic if you mandate in that environment. If you say you have to preserve, you have to contribute. So the question is, how do you protect that individual? And this is where you start to look at a comprehensive system of social security, because you can then add in other kinds of benefits and support frameworks that can protect that individual so they don't draw down their savings. So that means better designed unemployment insurance that's connected to retirement, because that's basically what it is. When somebody's asking for their to draw down, an early drawdown of their retirement savings because they've been unemployed, they're actually using their retirement benefit as an unemployment protection regime. So the question is our unemployment protection regime satisfactory? Because if it was, you wouldn't be drawing down. And if you could prevent people drawing down, you can mandate. But you can't mandate in an environment that hasn't got these connections and all these loose cables that are hanging in our system at the moment. So a further aspect is that very often you need to subsidize people whose incomes, even if they're earning an income or are not earning an income, you want people in households that have inadequate incomes to be protected as well. But you want a continuum, so that as your incomes do rise, you enter into the contributory systems which provide you with protection. If you fall down, you're falling into an environment in which you've got non-contributory benefits. So South Africa has an incredibly incomplete system, because if you're an adult in South Africa and you fall into unemployment, if your once your unemployment insurance runs out, you're basically stuck. And if you want to go and collect your unemployment insurance through our current system, the governance frameworks around unemployment protection are so bad that people queue. It takes ages to get your benefits out. And then when they run out, essentially you've got nothing. There's no programs, there's no coherent labor activation strategy in South Africa, there's no platforms for connecting income protection with labor activation, getting people to re-enter the labor market, and possibly in different contexts. So this is the kind of problem we're dealing with in South Africa, and everything that I've said can't be solved just with money. It's got to be solved with different types of schemes. And if you don't have those institutions, then we're sitting trying to put applications and protections, a bit like trying to put, the computer applications we have today on an Apple IIe. It just can't be done. And our system predates the Apple IIe. We really have a system with no bandwidth whatsoever. And part of the problem that I would argue has occurred around the Green Paper is that we've essentially had within South Africa a very narrow conversation about social protection going forward, a conversation largely between the financial services industry and the National Treasury. That is not the way to look at this going forward in South Africa and will leave us trapped in an environment that we're in today. So the question really is how do we revision the system? And secondly, in revisioning the system, how do you do so in a way that does not destroy incumbents who are very valuable within the system? Because that is also problematic. It will also end up with no reform happening, and it will also mean that you lose incredible assets within South Africa's highly developed financial services industry. But that conversation hasn't been allowed to happen. So effectively, you can't say, well, here's a set of options, here's what problem we're trying to solve, here's a suggestion, how do we do it better that doesn't involve destroying incumbents? How do we get the protection that we want and yet provide the protection, how do we provide the protection without harming any incumbents in the system as far as possible? Without having that conversation, you end up basically with a set of abstractions, which I'll kind of present. And I'll give one example. There are people who are quite familiar with the medical scheme system here. And in 1998, much of the medical scheme system objected to the introduction of the Medical Schemes Act of 1998. And they objected to it because it introduced a requirement for community rating and open enrollment. And what that did was it said open medical schemes couldn't just contract with employers. So you had this system. The system was in flux, but it was basically converging on an individual market for medical cover and a group scheme market, multiple employer market. So pretty much like your umbrella schemes versus your tier 4 products. And what that act did, so this is just one simple, it doesn't solve all the problems, but one aspect that it changed within the system with open enrollment was it said a group scheme can't turn away an individual who applies. And basically, quite a lot of the incumbents at that point said, no, we're going to have a death spiral. We're going to crash. We can't cope with this. We've got to be able to underwrite these people to death who apply because they're all going to basically anti-select against our scheme. Well, we're in 2021. We haven't seen that. The schemes were able to protect themselves in the way they designed the multiple option arrangements. It's not an optimal design from a social protection perspective, but it allowed individuals and employers to join the same products without having to pay different prices. Now, that's just one simple example of solutions in an environment in which you actually create enhanced social protection without undermining an incumbent. There are other massive problems in the medical scheme system, which I won't go into, but all of them going forward require coherent processes to resolve them. So I'm not going to run through, I think, some issues, and I've got limited time, so warn me if I'm going over time. But and I probably won't finish everything, but I'll try and get, I think, some of the key messages through from in the conversation. So I've kind of gone through some context. I'm going to look at basically some of the problems that need to be solved, what needs to be done, and then talk a bit about the systems approach to social security reform. So essentially, part of the problem is that we have, in part of the incumbents, one of the reasons why you'll have seen the Green Paper being withdrawn, it wasn't just the opposition of the financial services industry. It was also the fact that you have public sector vested interests that are involved. So the public sector vested interests that would have a problem with the proposal is that it essentially involves impacts on everything from the GEPF to the PIC to the compensation fund to the unemployment insurance fund to the road accident fund. And so you have lots of public sector vested interests who in many cases are deeply corrupt. And then you also have the unions who also are lackluster, and I think everybody's pretty much aware that there are lots of bargaining council schemes and lots of vested interests around those bargaining council schemes, which are not necessarily adding a great deal of value to the protection that is being offered. And the issue is they would probably want to protect their interests in any reform as well. So the issue is it's complex, lots of incumbents, but we also have lots of different government departments that are involved in making social security policy, because you have the Department of Labor and Employment, you have the Department of Social Development, you have National Treasury, you have the Department of Health, who actually also impacts on certain of those products, the Department of Transport, and etc. So all of these different departments, if you've ever had to deal with them, and I've had to, is there is zero innovation, absolutely no innovation that comes out of that group in terms of reconceptualizing their public purpose. So we have a patchwork, basically, of very narrow programs, very narrow schemes. We have no center point within government that is actually thinking creatively about the vision for the entire system and its institutional framework, because it's parceled between all these different departments, all with their own vested interests. So this is not just one set of interests. And this is natural in a large reform area. This is not an unnatural feature. In any system that's basically a late starter to a major reform of this kind, it has to deal with everybody that is already there. Now, you can't go in and steamroller everybody. You have to go in and try and work out solutions that are in the public interest, but also accommodate the incumbents one way or another, but not to the detriment of the public interest. So essentially, this is the key issue, is that when we're looking at any kind of major reform, it is typically going to be incremental reform. It can't be anything else. So I'll give you an example on national health insurance. They've actually proposed a non-incremental reform. And then they've proposed that they walk back from saying we can implement this in 12 months to then saying, oh, we'll implement this over longer and longer and longer time periods. And that's how they've kind of got out of demonstrating that they've got any kind of case. The problem with national health insurance is that it was proposed in about 2007 and nothing has been implemented. That's just talk. And that's not an incremental reform. What's interesting is that in the health reforms, all incremental reforms stopped. Nothing in the public sector, no governance reform of the system of medical schemes, no harmonization of the systems. That's what will often happen in an incremental reform. So the incremental reform isn't that you create this draconian structure and then you take tiny steps to get there. Very often, it's a process in which the policy process has to learn step by step with very key problems that it solves first and then moves forward. But very often, you do have to have a penciled-in construct that gives you a sense of direction. So the context is also, as I've indicated, we've got huge inequality, structural unemployment, and it can be argued that a large part of our unemployment is potentially because we don't have a system to counterbalance inefficiencies in the way we distribute income in South Africa. So markets aren't efficient. I know everybody thinks they are. You know, some people have had to do economics as part of their courses in business science or in actuarial science. Most of the original concepts in economics were sort of mathematical, theoretical constructs. They're not the way the real world works. The real world works with very complex institutional arrangements. If I know you and I do business with you because I like you and the fact that you're actually providing an ongoing service and it's expensive for me to go and find somebody else to do business with, I stick with you. That's not how Economics 101 works. In Economics 101, the idea is that if somebody else competes with you and drops the price by 0.01% relative to somebody offering the same product, you switch. Switching is expensive. Networks develop. Networks are institutional arrangements that don't work like markets. So the fact of the matter is that the way in which income is distributed generally does not reward people for what they do. It rewards some people, but it doesn't reward them perfectly. And to assume it does is incorrect. There are also huge consequences to society if the distribution of income dries up for huge numbers of people. It kills off areas, kills off business, kills off employment, changes the structure of purchasing. So if you had to look at many countries in Europe, they have institutionalized redistribution schemes that counterbalance the market. They don't eliminate the market. They don't eliminate distributional differences in income. But what they do is they make sure that there is a demand structure across all of society that is always maintained. So, and this is an example of it. So if you had to look, this is all, unfortunately, it's a bit sort of, this is your sort of top 20, top sort of the OECD countries. And what this shows is the difference in the Gini coefficient pre-tax and post-tax in all these countries. And in inequality. Now the inequality, this is the inequality you'd get pre-tax, post-tax, so after they've redistributed. So every country in the world, and it's difficult to sort of pick them out individually, but you'll take your countries with the best distributions of income around here, you'll see that pretty much every country will have roughly the same distributions of income pre-tax if they didn't have a redistribution system in. It isn't a function of GDP. It's actually probably the reason that they have a high GDP is the fact that they've got an adequate distribution of income. So if you don't redistribute, it doesn't matter how big your economy is, you're going to converge on a country like South Africa. You're going to look like us. If you're Sweden and you withdrew all of your income transfers, you will look like South Africa within 10 years. We are the end point of a bad system of distribution. So this is kind of what you have, is that in many cases, a key problem you're trying to solve is you've got income distribution problems, you've got social contingencies like getting ill, losing employment, etc., and you've got an economic context that might in fact be driving your distribution of income. And through your distribution of income, you might be exacerbating a number of social contingencies. It now really is much worse. You get ill and you're earning hand to mouth. You can't afford to be off work for 10 days because then they won't pay you for those 10 days. So you've got people in that precarious level of employment. You've got an economic context that generates, that exacerbates the impact of those social contingencies. So that is also your social context feeding into that. So the issue is you've got to look, and I won't go into this in detail, but basically you've got to look at your social context, your economic context, and you've got to create a balance. If you don't, you exacerbate these social distortions, and they become embedded, permanent, and you segment large parts of society. Basically, you look like South Africa. And it's institutional arrangements that change that. So essentially, the problem that you're trying to solve can be sort of broken into two parts of risk management. One is you've got to prevent the risk from happening, and the other is you've got to mitigate it once it does happen. So much of our contributory social insurance, private pensions, etc., is in this mitigation regime, which is necessary. But basically, the disaster has happened, so to speak, and you're compensating for it. So in insurance, you've got to look at loss due to expenses. That's, I get ill, I need to see a doctor. Loss of income, loss of support. In the case of services, this is where we're quite weak on the whole. You would, for instance, need things like labor activation, healthcare services, social care, also social intermediation. You need to go into a household and support them to connect up with the areas of support they require. So for instance, I have somebody who's a domestic worker. Her sister dies. She had 4 children. Those 4 children are now distributed between a grandmother and her. It's taken 2 years, they still haven't managed to get a foster care grant because the social worker doesn't actually fill in the papers. That's how our system currently operates. You can access the child support grant relatively easy, but the foster care grant isn't distributed easily. So you need services as an intermediation. And by the way, in the case of adoption and things like that, the problem is that you need to have a magistrate and somebody make a sort of a court order decision about the placement of a child and to ensure that they're properly protected in the environment that they're in. And the moment you introduce that intermediary, if it's inefficient, then you actually lose the service. You lose the support. And then in prevention of risk, there's an issue of basic income. And this is basically where you have to start looking at separating remuneration from labor as your only method of getting income. So we've got two basic remunerations that we'll receive from assets, incomes that we earn from assets, and incomes that we earn from working. If you've got a bad distribution, if basically the only method we've got for distributing income to a large part of society is employment, and you don't have employment, then basically you're harming a large number of people, many of whom are dependents in any case. So I was a dependent for many years. Many people, everybody in this room was a dependent of somebody else. You don't expect to earn an income when you're 5. And somebody that's actually, even if they choose to look after you during a period and not to earn an income, that's potentially also beneficial and can be seen as appropriate from a social perspective, and it's unremunerated for people. And so many countries in the world have separated this out. They've started to try and find ways in which they will provide income support to people to stay at home, look after children, go back to work. Sweden would be an example of that. So you can have basic income that's unconditional, categorical, or targeted. Unconditional means you get it, the so-called basic income grant discussion. The categorical would be you get it if you're between the ages of 0 and 18, you get a grant in that respect, or over the age of 60, or if you're disabled. Targeted would be by the means subject to some sort of means test or a tax clawback in the case of a universal benefit. So typically you'd have a range of these. This prevents certain distributional problems from arising, causing social harm. So to actually create a coherent system across all of these is actually quite complex. You need the institutional arrangements to ensure that you've got harmonization across all of these arrangements. South Africa doesn't have it at all. What we have is a sort of functional system on the top end of people around these kinds of arrangements. We're very poor on this. Healthcare might exist in the private sector, but it's subject to inefficient remuneration systems. And we have a paltry system of income benefits. None of these are connected across with an overall strategy in mind. So essentially what you need in an overriding system is you want to have a system where in the low income end you've got redistributive support, and in the high income end you've got insurance arrangements. And you've got to create a harmonized set of institutional arrangements across that. But this is what we have. So this is just a breakdown of our kind of complex system. And without going into it in detail, the issue is that we actually can't move with this. It's largely, it's stuck in mud. This system can't work. There's absolutely no way you can create coherent benefits across this. Why do we have a Department of Transport running a social security fund? They have absolutely no idea what they're doing. And I've engaged with them since 2002, since I was in the Taylor Committee. They have no policy. They don't have a policy team. There's nothing there. They hire consultants who come and do some stuff for a while and then they disappear. They run airports company. They run transport agencies. They've got 11 agencies, one of which is the Road Accident Fund. They don't know what they're doing. And basically we lose all the social value out of this component. Social development deals with social assistance, and it's meant to be a policy coordinator of Social Security. We have SASSA that falls kind of under that, but Department of Social Development unusually actually has no relationship with SASSA. SASSA can do what the hell it likes. It has a relationship to the minister and a very problematic institutional framework in which the minister can interfere in procurement decisions of SASSA, and that must end. Labour and employment. If I've been to the discussions with the commissioner, with the Unemployment Insurance Fund, they have a board, an advisory board. Just to note, as everybody would know, there's a difference between a supervisory board and an advisory board. Advisory board is toothless and a waste of space. A supervisory board is scary if they can hire and fire you. We have advisory boards for this structure, which essentially means that we've got institutions that are vulnerable to patronage, which is why the UIF accumulated a massive surplus and the compensation fund that is completely out of all proportion internationally. So and it's been commented on by the ILO, this looks ridiculous. The only time these funds have been dipped into is because of COVID. And despite having all that money, their systems only find out about you when you try to become a beneficiary. So think of, I mean, you're all pretty familiar with contributory schemes and administration systems. It requires individualization. I become a member of a fund. I list people who are dependents. Well, these funds don't do that. They wait until you're applying to be a beneficiary. Then they find you. Then they confirm that you're actually employed with that company that actually paid something on your behalf for a period of time. That's when they start to check that stuff. So there's no account, you're not a member of the Unemployment Insurance Fund, which is why they couldn't actually introduce furlough schemes during COVID. They haven't got the administrative systems to do so, despite having a fund of over 100 billion rand sitting there doing nothing. Why would they not invest in systems? What kind of organization does that? Well, that's a governance problem. The compensation fund, it's interesting, the entire medical scheme system switched to doing electronic billing in by 2001 in South Africa. The administrators had completely converted from paper chasing to electronic billing and invoicing with providers after lots of complaints and so on and moaning and groaning. The compensation fund still hadn't done that. Still can't do it now. So that's why their claims take ages to get paid out, which is actually why they have a large reserve. They had about a 60 billion rand reserve. Why would they have such a reserve? Because they're not paying benefits, because they take so long to process claims, and because they're unaccountable. So I won't go through everything. Home Affairs is a disaster. We don't have harmonization within the region around benefit entitlements, which can create anti-selection risk if we don't have harmonization across SADC. We have SARS that does all sorts of things. PIC, which has a governance structure which is highly problematic because it has political appointments into it. And that basically, once you have a large piggy bank like that sitting there in government and you have political appointments over it, it is obviously it's a patronage asking for corruption. And we've had it. And that entire PIC, if you go to Sweden, they'll have broken up their asset managers in the state into 4 structures. They'll be under proper governance. So they've eliminated large parts of the risk. In the United States, they won't go into a fully funded public sector. Their civil service scheme doesn't fully fund, doesn't advance fund. And certainly their social security system dare not advance fund because the amount of money you would accumulate in that fund would corrupt the government more than it is in the United States. So the issue is that these very, very large pots of money require very, very strong governance systems around them. And in some cases, if you don't have to have them, it's better not to. You find ways. That's why social security systems on the whole are pay-as-you-go with partial reserves, not full reserves, because that actually creates pots of money and dangerous incentives. So but basically you can break down South Africa's social security system into a formal and informal. And I just want to make that distinction very quickly. Formal is where you have some kind of rights-based framework that is institutionalizing access to a guaranteed minimum benefit. So when somebody joins a scheme on a voluntary basis, it's It's an informal social protection system. Often the mandates are required to protect risk pooling. So that's where you introduce a mandate. In the case where you're mandating savings, you're trying to create a smoothing consumption across somebody's lifetime. But to prevent drawdowns, you have to make sure they're pooling somewhere else. So if you had to look at just the financial value of our informal social protection system, includes the private systems, which are voluntary, and our formal systems, which include our public sector social insurance schemes, which amount to less than 1% of GDP, and your public sector schemes, and you can technically count medical schemes as part of a formal, but it's only partial because of the prescribed minimum benefits, tax subsidies, etc. So what you have, sorry, that didn't sum up there, but it's basically, this comes to about 7.9% of GDP. Your informal would be about, formal would be about, goodness, sorry, it wasn't, I'd quickly taken my tables and not checked, but it would work out at probably around about sort of 5 to 6% of GDP. So essentially we have a social protection system that is the formal side that actually offers some kind of minimum guarantee that is quite small in comparison to our informal social protection system. And just one, I think, important understanding from that is that when you look around the world at how much people contribute to social protection, it typically amounts in all countries to around about 30% of GDP. So what I'm not including in this is intra-household transfers, when you help relatives, when you support people one way or another when they're compromised. So that when you add that in, it works out at roughly 30% of GDP, whether you're talking about Ethiopia or the United States or Sweden. The difference between countries is the composition of the 30%. How much is distributed between formal and informal? How much actually embeds some kind of minimum benefit framework, some kind of social guarantee? So when you start to look at large parts of the European, continental Europe, you're looking at formal being about 80% of total social security spend. If you look at the United States, around about 50%. If you look at large parts of Africa, it's around about 5-6%. If you look at South Africa, it'll be about sort of 7%, 8%, and I'm not calculating all of informal social protection in this. So part of social security reform is about introducing these guarantees, shifting parts of the system into formal protections. Formal protections don't necessarily involve public sector schemes doing it. They very often involve institutional frameworks that can ensure that a guarantee can be delivered through an institutional framework. So it's actually relatively simple to do this, let's say, in a medical health insurance system. A private health insurance system doesn't require a state scheme to run it in order to ensure that there's a minimum guarantee. We haven't introduced it in South Africa, but we can. And if you did it, you'd have the same effects as you would out of a dysfunctional public scheme. So the issue is, what's the institutional framework that they get these guarantees? Now, across all of these benefit types, health, illness, old age, invalidity, loss of support, maternity, children, foster care, etc., all of those require some thought as to the institutional mechanism involved. Some of them you can combine, some of them you can offer separately, but you've got to actually have a harmonized system across all of these to have some efficiency overall. And you want to build off the systems that already exist. So we've basically done nothing, and there's no movement from 2000 to 2018. And our contributory private system is relatively large. It's larger than our formal social protection regime. So comprehensive social security reform is therefore looking at the composition of the 30%. That's basically what the discussion is, not increasing expenditure beyond the 30%, but merely looking at the composition. And it doesn't have to change the players. It has to just change the rules of the game so that people can have a set of social guarantees. That's basically the task. And South Africa hasn't even begun that task, which is very dangerous for South African society. Very, very dangerous. We've seen what's happened this year, and how easy it is to trigger social unrest in an environment that is so unequal, in which you introduce sparks of desperation into society. We are starting to basically to become more fragile as a society, and that's an incredibly dangerous thing, because ultimately it undermines the political structure as well, which can't sustain high levels of inequality, unemployment, and perceived unfairness that 70 to 80% of the population have. Not showing this in the numbers, but round about most of our income is earned by the top 50% of the top 10% of income earners. They earn most of South Africa's remuneration from assets and labor. And it's more skewed if you look at who owns assets. So that type of distribution can't be sustained, but you also can't just unravel it. You have to create systems that make sure, and institutions that make the society more fair. It's not just about a Julius Malema coming in and saying, let's just take from them and give to everybody else. That doesn't work. It's never worked anywhere. You have to invest in institutions. So this just gives you an idea of these funds. As you can see, overall the road accident fund goes up to expenditures about 0.8% of GDP, and basically one of the most valueless social insurance funds we have in South Africa. It delivers nothing in terms of social protection. And these funds just hover at the same level indefinitely with no innovation, no change. This is the breakdown of the sort of formal protection regime, including medical schemes, which is actually kind of problematic in a way because it is still a voluntary system. But your non-contributory system accounts for 7% of GDP, and your contributory public schemes count for about 2% at the end of the day. So this is if we had to remove medical schemes, we're basically only looking at about 9% of GDP. That's basically our social insurance system. This is a controversial part, which directly affects your business as well. This is what South Africa's National Treasury has considered social protection in South Africa. It's a quantification of the value of the tax subsidies given to the retirement system. Now, if you look at the tax expenditure subsidy reports of National Treasury in the budget review, it will count the tax subsidy you get as a deduction for the contribution, and it will count the rebates in the retirement rebates in the retirement period, and it will count the tax subsidies you get in lump sum and so on, very sort of small amounts. But what it doesn't actually quantify is the withdrawal, the value of the zero withholding tax on the return on investment, affects the investment side. And it used to be an 18% withholding tax that was withdrawn in about 2003. So that's across all the assets under management in the retirement system. And that 18% withholding tax was dispensed with without much debate in South Africa. So you can see the debate and the discussion that happens around extending the social relief of distress grant and grant subsidy, but nobody debates the removal of the 18% withholding tax. Nobody, virtually nobody ever noticed it, because very few people are plugged in to that system and understand what that was. Well, this basically quantifies. This is the state old age pension on a per capita basis, and this is the value of tax subsidies per capita for people in retirement over these periods. Now, obviously, the return on investment is lower there, higher here. And so you're looking at an amount, let's say, estimated in 2015 of about 181,000 Rand per beneficiary at that stage, just on the interest on pensions. Basically, if you had to take a benchmark withholding tax assumption and say, well, that's actually a subsidy to the retirement system. And that's what we pay people on social grants. And laughably, National Treasury had in its budget review until a report was published indicating this, is that they said that one of the reasons for the tax subsidies in the retirement system was to prevent people from becoming dependent on that grant. So you can see how ludicrous that was. They were actually spending that to save that. And when it was noted in a report that was published, they immediately removed their rationale for the tax subsidies. So this is the point about institutional designs. This is a very inefficient design for ensuring that people enter into contractual savings. It drives people into these savings and is a substitute for a mandate. So if you did introduce a mandate, you don't need to use a tax subsidy to persuade people to join. Now I'm going to raise another issue that's quite important, is that we say, well, people don't save enough for retirement because most employers in South Africa fire you at the age of 65. Well, some countries in the world don't allow that. You can't fire a person at 65. What they do is you participate in a pension scheme, and at some point in time, it's in your interests to basically cash in your pension scheme and to stop working. But the employer can't fire you. They can't basically say you have now reached the age of retirement and you must go, despite the fact you're perfectly healthy and competent. So this is one of the reasons we have such pressure on our retirement system, is that because people have to save for a period in which they're perfectly healthy and employable, but we allow employers to fire them legally. So in many systems, you also look at how retirement ages are set and whether or not employers are allowed to set those ages at that age. That takes a huge pressure off. You can continue working. So the issue is to say, well, what we're going to do is give tax subsidy so you have enough money when they fire you at 65. It doesn't make sense as an overall structure, and it should basically be socially renegotiated. The idea also that you need to fire people at 65 to create space for people to come in at the bottom is also complete nonsense. There's no relationship between the two. Somebody who's actually very, very experienced and has accumulated a lot of knowledge isn't basically occupying the job of the new entry, the new entrant into the system. They're very often contributing to the economy and creating jobs through their participation. But when you fire them all at 65, they're not. So this is part of the inconsistency and part of a debate that we don't have. This is another feature of the system that's quite interesting. South Africa, you know, the international rating agencies look at South Africa's accumulated debt and say, you know, we're junk. We should basically have our assets, the state, certainly government bonds, declared as junk, because essentially government is overborrowed. And I'm going to give you another argument for what we're seeing in the South African state balance sheet. So this is the Government Employees Pension Fund. So I'm giving you the stream of income, not the total assets under management, which I think you're all aware of. Here's the employer contribution, 45 billion rand in 2017. Employee contributions, 25 billion. We have investment income of 72 billion, so total revenue 142 billion. We have benefits paid out of 94.9 billion. So that received is a surplus going into accumulating assets of 47.5 billion. Now, South Africa has, in the Government Employees Pension Fund, it's fully advance funded. It's basically a termination reserve. So if you had to think, what's the logic of a termination reserve? Termination reserve is there if you're in an employer scheme, and basically it goes belly up. And you basically need to have enough assets to cover all your current and future promises in that fund to everybody at date of termination. Right, so let's think of when you would need to exercise that termination reserve in a government employees pension fund. What contingency would require you to have to terminate the fund? It's basically the end of the South African economy, because essentially this is the public sector employees. Government goes bankrupt. How does the government go bankrupt? Well, the economy is gone. Well, if the economy is gone, then everything you've invested in the economy is also gone, which means that the only time in which you would actually exercise that termination reserve is at a point in time when it would have no value. The fully advanced funded GEPF is an absolute nonsense. Internationally, the US government doesn't do it, the European governments don't do it, their civil service schemes are all partially funded. Why do we do it? And when you start to look at the size of the asset that has been unnecessarily accumulated, it's a substantial portion of government's existing accumulative debt. Government has basically incurred debt in order to basically create an asset in the GEPF. That's why we're in debt. This is Chinese bookkeeping. But we don't treat it as if that asset can be offset against government debt because of the way we see liabilities and structured within government. So we're blind to it. So now government is bankrupt because it's got such a large debt, and yet it's got this asset that it doesn't need. Government could unwind this reserve over 20 years if it wanted to, and have enough money to pay off the debts of Eskom, the rest, free up funds. But here I'll give what the sort of the left will be saying about this position. And I'll say in relation to the withholding tax, the 18% withholding tax. So you think of the period when it was withdrawn. It was the beginning of a commodities boom in South Africa. And during that commodities boom, a real problem starts to emerge within government, and that you start to accumulate surpluses. It's the last thing you want when people start saying, well, out of growth, you need to spend that money on more redistributive services and functions. The best is to make sure that we're always dealing with a fiscal constraint. We're always impoverished. We're always a government with holes in our shoes. So what you do is you essentially make sure that government is always fiscally constrained. There is never a point in time where GDP grows fast enough that you accumulate a surplus that you can actually fund the programs you say you will only fund when things are looking good. Because you don't want to incur a long-term liability by creating, let's say, an income grant system or an expanded system. You don't want to create that long-term liability with what might be a temporary boom. So let's look at the withholding tax being withdrawn. That is essentially wiping out, on a permanent basis, a stream of income to government. Permanent, not temporary. Not related to a cycle. It was the cycle, by doing that, took government revenue out. It reduced the surplus. When you pay into this fund, you're also reducing the surplus. So there's a question as to whether or not government's balance sheet is actually a lot better than it looks. But it's no simple matter to unscramble this egg without thinking through these issues properly and actually starting to face up to them. Because when we look in South Africa and listen to the debates which say we are fiscally constrained beyond all reason, we have to be so dreadfully careful, have we actually got a fiscally constrained government? Now, this is quite aside from all the money that has been lost in irregular expenditure and corruption in South Africa, which is vast. But the point is, we actually have more opportunities than we think. But I'm not saying that it is simple to do these things, but the point is we are not bankrupt. We're far from it. But this type of arrangement raises all sorts of questions about what is actually the agenda here. And so part of the discussion here is that, in fact, this has actually created a completely unnecessary investment fund in a state structure with poor governance. And is that the agenda? Very few people in the financial services sector will moan about this because part of those assets are farmed out to asset managers in the private sector. So who's going to ask questions about that? And you're not going to worry about that sort of 5 to 6% of the PIC that is being irregularly allocated to buddies, or the interference that occurs in boards in the private sector. All of those come from a patronage structure created through a government structure that is actually centralizing power through a fund. So why I'm raising this is also in relation to the way in which the Green Paper was deliberated on in the public space, as if the idea was that certain people are proposing the establishment of a state fund in order to steal from people. The issue is to look at new institutions that don't do this and to have this conversation, but it's a difficult conversation. So I think that there's a lot to talk about in sort of revisioning the system. So essentially, I've kind of gone through those. I'm sorry, I know I'll finish off in 5 minutes. There's no way I'll finish the whole presentation, but I've covered quite a lot of the issues that I wanted to. But maybe what I'll do is kind of move into essentially the problems that we're trying to solve, is we essentially need to have a harmonized policy formation process in government around social security. Many countries have that. It's incredibly unusual to have a national treasury running around making social security policy. It's very unusual. For some reason, it's tolerated in South Africa. Well, we'll see how far that goes. But that strongly suggests that there's a lobby working through Treasury. And people are aware of it now. And it's going to create big problems. And government basically has to get its act together. It can't be that you've got this antagonistic relationship to making policy where somebody wants their stuff through so they get National Treasury to do something they're not competent to do in order to get their way. So you need a harmonized policy formation, harmonized financing framework. Harmonized is not centralized. Harmonized is it's coordinated and in some cases integrated. You need integrated governance and accountability frameworks. So integrated governance and accountability frameworks isn't creating one fund, an NHI and Eskom. That's the last thing you want. In electricity provision in South Africa, we should have been investing for the last 15 years in a decentralized institutional framework that allows for the autonomous generation of electricity under reasonable governance. You allow multiple players to do their own thing. You harmonize, but you don't centralize. That's part of also how you design social security schemes, because they're redistributive schemes, social insurance schemes, private arrangements. And because I run out of time, and there's quite a lot of detail on the other slides which you can look at in the PDF, but what's quite important in this is that social insurance schemes, if they are created as a public scheme, I make the distinction between what I'd call a public scheme and a state scheme. South Africa cannot invest any more money in state schemes. State schemes are where you basically have the executive in control of a fund or a structure. You can't have that anymore. Around the world, there are many examples of public schemes. Now, public schemes can have whatever governance framework you want to design for it so that it basically fulfills a public purpose. It's an institutional design, a corporate governance design that matches the needs of that aggregates the interests of whoever is the key beneficiary of that organization, that supervises the executive of that organization. But what you don't have is ministers appointing their buddies into state structures. So what we've had in South Africa, and virtually every single one of our structures, including regulators, are state structures. They are state structures. That's what's got to end. Public schemes, you basically create the rules of incorporation so that it's got a clear public purpose if it's going to, and you avoid establishing monopolies. So to the extent that a public structure is created, that's why you do have multi-tiered structures. Even if you look at China at the moment, they have no qualms, people talking about single-tier health systems in South Africa, multi-tier health system. No problem, because there's no BS in getting the job done in that environment. They create whatever works. We basically have to do the same. And we need harmonized administration frameworks. Again, harmonized, not centralized. That means some structures are centralized, but if anything is centralized, then the corporate governance design must protect the integrity of the functioning of that organization. And I'll tell you, nobody's looked at that in the last 27 years in the design of state systems. They have the PFMA ludicrous range of corporate governance designs, which are guaranteed to make every single state entity capturable and merely becomes an entity for corruption. So what I'll do is I'll finish at this point. I see that I've run on too late. But I think that what I've done is at least created a sense of where the conversation needs to go. And there are specific proposals that are in the presentation which you can look at. But I would say there's a great difficulty and a great danger in policy making, is that it is easy to create institutional frameworks in abstract. They are not the end of a discussion, as has occurred in NHI. They are the beginning of a discussion. And that if that institutional structure doesn't work, then we need to think of what other institutional structure gets that job done. And that's the conversation that needs to happen in South Africa, and it's one that has to involve all stakeholders, in my view. It's a conversation that is going to happen regardless of whether or not the Green Paper was withdrawn, because it has to happen in South Africa, otherwise we will become permanently unbalanced. And it will take quite a while before we get a decent institutional framework in place. But I think these problems can be solved if we have decent public processes that create the space for this conversation to be productive, which we haven't done to date. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for that presentation. You know, sometimes you don't understand idioms or phrases like pulls no punches until you watch a presentation like that. Thanks so much for your insight and for setting up the context of where we started, the challenges we face, and pointing out the different issues at play with social security, as well as pointing out the importance of links that offer protection to citizens, and finally taking us through how to look at institutions that we take for granted in a very different way in order to solve some of the challenges that you spoke about. Up next is Mark Fox, who leads NMG's Global Strategic Insights business, which supports global asset and wealth managers with data analytics and insight. Mark will be giving us a global perspective on how international peers have implemented ESG, how it has developed globally, and NMG's experience. A very good morning to you, Mark. If you can hear us, it's over to you.
Sustainable investment strategies from our US business to Australia, or should I spend time on a domestic equity fund range and pursuing a new concept for global listed infrastructure, for example? I decided on the latter because maybe I didn't see a viable market. People were in the dark. And the reason for this story is to make the point that incentives matter. To paraphrase Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England and now the UN's Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, he said recently that finance is a service and a means to an end, delivered by focusing on hard numbers. So debit and credit, profit and loss, return on investment, and value at risk. So incentives are important because, and we are where we are in the adoption of ESG because the incentives have started to align. Sadly, it's taken us far too long to recognise the need for change. But it is very recognisable today. So natural disasters, climate change, social movements, political extremism and protests, the public has begun to take note. Politicians, surprisingly go where the public goes, have recognised that shift and have been compelled to act. So this has led to increased pressure on the private sector, including corporations and money managers. And so that's the story. Now the incentives are there and regulatory headwinds are beginning to turn into tailwinds. That's contributing to an uptick in activity, interest, and funds are flowing, as you probably have all read, into ESG-related funds. Now, all this trend sounds nice. At some point, you have to implement ESG considerations in your portfolio. The trend doesn't make that any easier. And again, the incentives aren't still entirely aligned, say, with funding defined benefit pension deficits. But before we get there, a quick word from our sponsor, if you will. So before I get to the main slide, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the research that we performed to answer the question why we conducted a study into ESG around the world and how we implemented it. Mainly, we began this study because we observed across our other programs over 5 to 6 years during our conversations with asset owners across those studies that we started seeing early signs that ESG was beginning to gain serious momentum and adoption. And in our conversations with asset managers who ultimately are our clients for this research, a few things became evident. Firstly, that there was demand. So several managers have become aware of the same trend that we had observed and had begun to position on ESG. So, and asset owners themselves lacked good information. We spoke to asset owners at length about this, and they'd begun, and they were curious about what their peers were doing. And by sending the findings back to them in a nice neat package after the study, we've been able to connect them together. Secondly, there was a need for a globally consistent view, but asset owners and managers didn't have that consistent view. So different researchers in several markets with varying methodologies and outputs were kind of impossible to reconcile and make sense of. Finally, objectivity was required, so asking clients for their time is one thing, asking them to provide an objective view of your capabilities is harder, and in our experience, it helps to be objective and provide confidentiality as it opens up the conversation. So we kind of act as objective agents in the field, and we're able to open up some pretty deep and meaningful conversations around these issues for asset owners and really unpack what their challenges are and get their sort of honest perspectives of various stakeholders in the market and how they're performing, particularly around asset managers. So we developed an annual objective, globally consistent study of the ESG market. We cover both asset owners and we do some financial advisor research as well. And we only speak with asset owners, so institutions, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurers and the likes that are adopting and integrating ESG. We perform this study annually, so we capture the annual metrics and the trend data, including brand impressions of asset managers, drivers of consideration selection, and unprompted citations for ESG leadership from a dedicated study of ESG investors. So this is not a broad sample of investors, including those who have little experience in ESG. We want to speak to those people that are really at the coal face and are facing the real challenges, and they're able to provide really good perspectives from which our clients and other asset owners can learn. Okay. So how is ESG progressing? I just quickly pause and just say, when I'm talking about ESG, you talk about the range of ESG approaches. So it kind of encapsulates responsible investing, and when I talk about sustainable investing, that's kind of leaning towards the impact side of things, but we'll come to that later. So how is ESG adoption progressing? The numbers on the left-hand side look pretty big, and I would reiterate that our sample is targeted at ESG investors. If we were to include a wider population, then the averages probably come down a little bit. What is surprising to me, though, is that there's quite a bit of third-party research out there that has quite big numbers in terms of the proportion of assets that currently have some sort of ESG consideration over them, and those numbers and those gross numbers out there aren't too short of ours, and we have quite a focused sample. So mostly it depends on what you count for ESG and what kind of assumptions you make, but that's a discussion for another time. Setting aside those differences, what's important is how ESG develops, and I'll just make a few points about what we've seen over the last few years, and we'll come back to some of the data on the slide. Firstly, very few investment teams have, in our experience and what we have seen, kind of opted into ESG voluntarily. So generally this begins as, with stakeholder pressure, and that's generally what has driven it in the past. And in my view, that makes perfect sense. It's hard to tell a successful investor that they ought to suddenly consider this other set of factors, and they will likely tell you that if it had worked, they'd already be doing it, and that's natural. Change is difficult, but it isn't impossible. Sadly, it generally takes some kind of tragedy or disaster for people to shed themselves of their cognitive biases, which is why COVID-19 was such an accelerator for this way of investing. And we can see that on the right-hand side. And we see the general, we asked our investors what the impact of COVID-19 had been on their responsible investing allocations. And as you can see, there is a tendency to increase those allocations as a result of COVID-19. And that's just because that's where the focus is. Very few investors are actually doing less ESG or allocating less or decreasing their allocations, and that's significant. And again, so those that are maintaining allocations, for the most part, these are already quite large allocations, and so the general momentum behind adoption was already there. It was already tracking positively, and so COVID didn't, for those that are maintaining allocations, they're already doing enough, so it wasn't really a spur in terms of momentum. One of the most surprising things here, I think, is the potential growth in ESG investing in the US. So you can see in North America, there's quite a big delta there of 26%, so the proportion of assets that are in responsible investment allocations today compared to where they expect them to be in 3 years. Investors telling us that there's a 26% uplift. That is not always consistent with what you hear in the market, and particularly if you talk to our friends in the United States of America, they will tell you that ESG is, what we hear a lot as ESG is largely European regulation, that it's not really having much of an impact in the US, and we've been hearing that for years. But that tide is starting to turn, and there's been a bit kind of failure to recognise that. And in fact, if you kind of look at policies of Joe Biden, for instance, he is definitely focused on ensuring that the regulatory environment is supportive of more ESG investing, whereas the previous president was less inclined, and in fact had introduced regulations in the form of through the Department of Labor that basically told pension funds they weren't to consider what are termed non-financial factors. But the current government seems to be turning that around. So finally, I think for this slide, despite its maturity, we see more growth in ESG investing, and primarily this will come not out of sort of new growth, at least in this sample, but ESG is spreading across portfolios. So it's coming from mainly begins in equities, ESG considerations move into fixed income, and we're seeing quite a bit of activity in private markets. So private markets is where we're seeing the most growth, and that is mainly driven by the ability to direct capital to areas of the most impact, and where you can have greater influence over, say, your GP. So as an LP, you have greater influence over your GP, particularly compared to your position as a minority shareholder, as an equity investor in public markets, right? So you just have more ability to influence the direction of your investments and what the outcomes are. So for most investors, COVID led them to increase their focus on issues across environmental, social, and governance factors. And I would emphasise again the word increase here. So wildfires, bushfires, floods, protests, political extremisms, they were all evidence enough for many, but for others, COVID sort of shined a light on ESG-related concerns such as wealth inequality, safety and fair pay for workers, transparency in supply chains, source of funds, and outsourcing questionable business practices to third parties in developing nations. So all those issues were increased in terms of their focus, and certainly the press. I'll give you an example. I interviewed an APAC sovereign wealth. I interview this sovereign wealth fund every year for one of our sovereign wealth fund study that we do, and he also participates in the ESG study. The portfolio strategist for a leader in ESG, so an asset owner, a sovereign wealth fund that's considered by many to be leading in ESG. But as a portfolio strategy professional, what was interesting is about 3 years ago, we were talking about ESG, and he was giving some relatively, I would say, edited answers. And so he was definitely speaking, he was talking the PR book. And as the conversation wore on, it kind of became pretty evident that he wasn't entirely 100% a believer in what they were doing and the impacts on. He was more mindful of performance issues and how he could generate long-term returns. And I just said to him, I said, you don't sound like you particularly believe that these things are aligned with your objectives. And he kind of just looked at me and said, no, I don't. And I felt that was quite interesting at the time. But 3 years later, I'm speaking to the same individual, and he has he has changed his view. So I think that's just an interesting story to sort of put colour and context to the trend here. So, and he spoke to me about climate change and the evidence that it would impact returns if it went unmanaged and unmitigated, right? So he's an investor that has quite a bit of exposure to property and other unlisted asset classes, and he was particularly concerned about issues that were related to potential for stranded assets. So I've just given you an explanation of the trend and how it is developing across the globe and the region. From here, we can get a little bit more granular on what this actually is and what institutions are actually doing and what the implications, challenges and solutions attempted are. But kind of before we get there, I think take a look at and let's take another look at the chart on the right-hand side and what is that actually telling us? In a sense, investors are ranking values. So if you read this literally, it kind of suggests that North American investors are more likely to invest in companies with potentially opaque sources of funds and financing than they are those materially contributing to climate change or that have poor health and safety records. Sometimes, and so we're being very selective about our dimensions of goodness, if you will, and what you're giving up on, and there are always unintended consequences. I think that this really came, this sort of observation you can see if you look at ESG funds out there in the market, so those that are being marketed by asset managers, the 10 biggest holdings of most ESG funds are tech companies. So are we sure that tech companies are responsible? What about privacy, weaponizing the worst aspects of humanity with algorithms and the spread of misinformation? How do we stack rank harm and ethics in that result, in that respect? So are carbon emissions worse than misinformation emissions? We've made, certainly investors have had to make a call here. That capital has to go somewhere. You have to achieve your investment objectives by investing in something. And so, what you focus on is where that capital flows. Right, so where asset owners have actually landed with respect to what to focus on. So how do we resolve those issues of, how do we rate carbon emissions versus privacy, corruption, diversity, inclusion, all those sorts of things. Where asset owners have landed with respect to what to focus on across the ESG landscape is really to determine which of these factors are material. So that is material to financial performance, material to the planet and society, or material to both. And here it's kind of worth drawing a distinction between these things. Right? So what is material to financial performance and how does it differ to what's material to the planet and society? You can kind of divide responsible investing into two categories. So outside in and inside out, as we like to refer to it. So outside in is really sort of assessing the impact of ESG factors on an investment valuation, and inside out is really assessing the impact that capital has on the world. And the way to think about it is that, the way that we think about it at least, is that outside in is generally concerned with financial performance or your risk-adjusted returns. And this is often what people mean when they talk about ESG. So the integration of these factors into valuations that sit alongside a range of other factors. So it's not the sole objective of valuation, but one of several. So one of several inputs into a company's valuation. Inside out, on the other hand, sort of describes sustainable investing and impact strategies. So you'll hear impact strategies mentioned quite a bit out there in the market, and sustainable investing. And those things are really more about how can I deploy capital to impact to make an impact while still generating a return on investment. An example of this would be an investment in social housing, for instance, or investing in a company to transition to new carbon, to transition to a lower carbon setting. Generally, we find that ESG begins with risk concerns. So that is the potential impact on financial performance for the most part, with, say, climate change. So for an example would be rising oceans, washing away hotel investments and leaving behind a stranded asset. Investors are going to generally begin their journey here, but what we find is that they tend to embrace wider objectives over time. And that's due to, so they'll move from just pure considerations of risk. Their stakeholder tells them they need to do something, they develop some policies around this, they focus on risk because that's, it's a very important aspect of managing a portfolio, and a really good place to start. But they tend to sort of move, up this sort of more positive and active approaches to ESG and into the more inside-out sustainable categories. And there's generally there's several factors that are driving this. That includes both just the very act of increasing your investment in resources and capability around ESG. That tends to be almost self-fulfilling, right? So you hire more people to do ESG, you do more ESG. There's regulatory pressure. So in Europe, we can see this with the EU taxonomy, SFDR, for example, which is compelling investors to consider these risks, make disclosures and report on their activities. And we have reputational risk as well. So considerations like social license to operate and commercial considerations like demand from beneficiaries, advisors, and even end customers. So the chart on the right side is indicative of those drivers. So as investor appetite and knowledge around sustainability become more sophisticated, investors sort of have begun to move away from having to invest sustainably towards wanting to make an impact in their investing. So investors use so how does all this get implemented, right? So investors use a range of tools to implement ESG. So if you look on the left-hand side here, and going from right to left, the tools used to implement ESG become sort of more active. So on the left, you've got negative screens or kind of divestment. These have traditionally been the most popular way of integrating ESG because it's pretty simple to do. And we find investors generally start here before moving on to more active approaches. Not only is it easy to do, but it's easier to explain. So it's particularly if you've got a commercial imperative, like say as an insurer or as a defined contribution pension scheme, then you're more likely to be able to explain that story. Like we do not invest in clustered munitions, we do not invest in tobacco. That's a pretty easy story to tell. Or one aspect is we screen out all high carbon emitters from our portfolio, and that again has something to do with consequences, but it's a reasonably simple story to tell, right, to the layperson. Then if we move up to the far right-hand side of that left-hand chart, we get to where most investors are actually heading, which is the global investors strongly prefer an active approach to ESG, and voting engagement, or stewardship as it's often referred to, becomes the preferred approach. So is it better, are you going to have a bigger impact on the companies that you invest in and their practices by not investing in them or selling your shares? Or are you going to achieve more by holding those shares? Because there's always a clearing price and somebody will always buy your shares. And so the thing I've heard recently from a CIO at a very large public pension fund in Canada, for instance, was, isn't it better that good people own bad companies than bad people own bad companies? So it's that kind of spirit that is behind this. But if you're looking to make a change and get a particular outcome, then certainly your ability to influence is greater if you invest rather than divest, and that seems to be where the market's heading. So this has led to an increase on this. So on the right-hand side, this is data from our sovereign wealth fund study, because we've been talking about this with them for many years. What has happened is, as the approaches to ESG and sustainable investing or responsible investing has become more active, we've seen basically a move back into active management strategies. So, which as we know for years has been losing share to sort of passive market cap weighted index investing. So the more that ESG moves through the investment markets, and the more that this gets adopted, actually it's better for active managers because the difficulty for passive managers is that you just have to buy all the entire index. And so it doesn't matter how those companies are behaving, what their policies are, or how ESG friendly they are. You are dedicated to investing in all those companies regardless. And so we've seen that often doesn't sit well with ESG policies. Right? So investors are moving back into active management as a result. So as investors pursue more impact and clear outcomes, we're seeing that we're moving from divestment and screening into voting engagement and more positive and clear need to demonstrate more impact and outcomes and better outcomes in their ESG investments. They naturally need to find the data to inform their decisions and to measure those outcomes. And this is a real challenge for everybody. It's well publicised that there isn't enough good data out there. To use an example, I think, how do I know the carbon offsets that, say, Royal Dutch Shell may buy are actually meaningful and are linked to a real outcome? So, are the credits that are attached to a piece of land, does that land actually have sufficient trees or the ability to capture carbon from the environment, or is it just a regular piece of land? So, that sort of data and validation is required if you're going to actually measure and be sure about the impact of your decisions and your investments. So it's much more difficult. What's much more difficult to do is really to get some data that shows, for example, the positive correlation between social factors like diversity and inclusion and company performance. So those are really difficult things to consider in your ESG policy. And while there's a lot of research around this, but there's not a great data set to look back on. So I can't look at 40 years of history to determine whether or not it's meaningful. In many respects, these things are unknowable right now, but historically companies have not measured or disclosed that data, right? So backtesting is difficult, as I've said, and investors have instead chosen to really focus on process. Right? So the results of a lot of these policies are really out there in the future and probably beyond the current extraordinarily long bull market. Right? So everything seems to work well at the moment, particularly in equities. So where data is not readily available or of sufficient quality, it's really hard to establish materiality. I said at the top that materiality has been the focus here. And so what we asked investors so what this slide shows is we asked them what they think is material to performance across those factors on the right-hand side. So these E, the S, and the G. And then we asked them, so that's a separate chart, and you can certainly send that to people. But what we asked them is that what of those factors that you consider to be material, what are currently not incorporated? So without sort of data to measure the impact of investing across these factors or considering them in your investment processes, investors have chosen largely not to consider them. So without data, it's really difficult to optimize your strategy or to get some confidence around those things. And that kind of goes back to my earlier point about tech stocks, right? So how do you measure sort of data protection and privacy in a relatively new industry? Like, so how do you measure the impact on planning performance? It actually has probably been a very good thing for financial performance, but we may not consider that to be the best business practice. For example, these are difficult decisions. Where do investors actually turn for good data? That's a question that we asked our asset owners. So you are pursuing more sustainable investment strategies. You want to see more impact in what you do. You want to measure those outcomes. You want to be able to report on them. And so we need good data there to support all that decision making. Where there is a sort of universe out there of providers of third-party data, and you can see those listed there on the left-hand side. And we asked them to rank them in terms of their quality, or rather, who are they using? And so most investors are using MSCI and Sustainalytics, which you may or may not know is owned by Morningstar. And there's some, so asset consultants are also where some investors can turn to for solutions here when it comes to data. But it's worth kind of pointing out that this is not perfect science. These these ratings agencies generally provide some sort of ESG score of companies. And the right-hand side shows you that, across a range of those providers, there's just very, very different scores that can be achieved, right? So we've hit a point now where investors are really crying out for good data, and there's providers out there, but now you need to sift through each of those providers to work out how they build their scoring, what are they emphasising, what are they de-emphasising, and so the conversations get really, really quite difficult over time. So there's no silver bullet out here, and where the market has actually moved is we've developed our own ESG policies and procedures. So this is on the more sophisticated end of the asset owners that we speak to. We've developed our own policy and procedures. You just send me the data that I need to plug into my frameworks. I like your scores, they look great, but I'd rather do my own thing. That's kind of where the market's headed. So, but in the meantime, there is still a range of investors and asset owners and customers that use these scores. And so at the cold face, you get asset owners talking to asset managers about their inputs into their process, and then they look at these scores, and if they've used those scores, then it tends to be a challenging conversation. Right, so I've moved through this at 40 minutes. I think I've used up most of my time. So I will just end the presentation by saying that, that the experience here when we talk to global asset owners, what's interesting is that this isn't easy. I think that's the main observation here, is that it's not easy. It isn't easy being green. Managing authentic transformation of an institutional portfolio and organisation is tough. So it does seem inevitable, though, and the question really is, what will you do and how far will you go? To begin with, you want to be clear on your purpose as an organisation, clarify a firm-wide approach, and that's critical to all stakeholders, whether they be investors, regulators, or your own internal stakeholders if you are a pension fund. And to carry out an ESG strategy, executives and investment leadership will really need to evolve their investment processes, their organisational design, and the data that they use to input into their processes. So it's not easy, but the ESG leaders that we speak to throughout the study are rapidly solving the challenges, and there's really a lot to learn from staying in touch with the market. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. A round of applause for him in the room. And I know we're almost at the end of the presentation. We're now going to have a panel discussion, which is going to be quite rapid fire, but insightful, I believe. I'd like to please ask Razia Ghani, who's the head of investment at NMG, Natasha Huguet-Henchy, who's the principal consultant, Craig Shudrawi, who's the head of retirement, and Alex to please come back onto stage so we can begin our panel discussion. Thanks all so much for your time on this panel today. Razia, perhaps I'll start with you. How does ESG get implemented, and what are suggested steps to follow?
So that's quite a big topic. But so the way we are doing it with a lot of our institutional clients is actually starting to think about what the ESG policy is. So we've got a process we follow where we actually do a belief session with clients, where we speak to trustee boards about what it is that they actually believe in terms of ESG, what it is that they want to achieve. So we ask a list of questions, we do various workshops about educational aspects, how to implement it, what's available, etc. And what we're trying to do is actually take trustee boards through a journey to get them to a process where they've got a formalized ESG policy, and then we assist them to implement that. So that's currently our process for institutional clients.
All right, Natasha, I'm going to come to you. What do actuaries in general feel should be an ideal retirement funding system in South Africa?
Thank you. That's a very complicated question. I'm currently part of an actual society working group looking at this very thing. When this National Treasury paper was withdrawn, not the National Treasury, the Green paper was withdrawn, we kind of said, let's look at it from first principles, and we currently are assessing it and say, look, what is the basic income grant aspects? How is that going to impact? What is the costs and the policy frameworks around that? What is the, as Alex referred to, the hanging cables that, UIF, the COID, that, you get a different benefit if you die driving your work van. You'll get your road accident fund and your COID benefit, whereas if you die from a heart attack, you're going to get a different benefit. Why should it be different? So that kind of thing. So and trying to integrate that, trying to understand all these policy frameworks. And then really to then, as a third kind of tier, what does an ideal framework look like? And really, how do we bring that into to being, given that we don't have clear income definition? If you're a fruit seller selling fruit, what is your income? It's going to fluctuate from month to month. How do we ensure a disability benefit for you around that? How do we ensure a death benefit for you around that? If you're going to make irregular contributions. So we really are applying our minds to these aspects so that we can try and get a policy, a social structure that will deal with for those kind of irregular workers, as well as the formally employed. The formally employed is an easier problem to solve. We're looking at it from all aspects.
I just want to pick up on that point, Alex, and ask you, Natasha was speaking about people who have different incomes. How do you believe the proposed retirement reform would work for people who are gig and commission workers?
Well, I think that part of the problem that we have is that and I go back to the point on what institutions do we need. Because if you look at the creating an institution or organization to respond to informality, informal workers, informal employers, precarious workers. Do you want to create a dedicated institution or organization to solve their problem? Or do you actually want to create a system in which their problem is also resolved and incorporated? So the issue is that we don't have any of these systems. And part of the problem, I would argue, is that the debate that we've had in South Africa have often been saying, well, let's just solve the problem of informal workers first, leave everybody else alone, because they're okay. They're not okay. People, even in stable jobs, are not okay. The platforms of support for people in normal working environments are not okay. They go through huge fluctuations. They need to be protected. And the platform that's created to protect them, whether it's a hybrid mixture of public and private institutions, needs to also be able to bring in the informal worker who will have to participate in the system on a voluntary basis, which means that you're dealing with a different form of insurance protection. It's not social insurance if you can't mandate. So these are the problems that need to be solved. We don't have the institutions, we need to have them, and we need to work out what problems we need to solve first from an institutional perspective, rather than saying we need to pick on informal workers and solve their problem first.
Mm-hmm. Greg, let's come to you. What are clients thinking about ESG in South Africa, and are they willing to implement?
Yeah, I think what we find at a high level, when sitting around the boardroom tables, and to Raj's earlier point, the large privately administered funds are really spending a lot of time looking at how do we implement ESG in their portfolios, because it's almost like a one-size-fits-all strategy for the fund. When you get to your small to medium-sized funds, we tend to find that the committees or the trustees will tend to lean towards the investment manager and sort of interrogate what are your processes, what are you doing about it, come back to us and tell us about how you're doing that. In your member investment choice funds, and this is just my view going forward, I think you've just had to look down the line a good couple of years and listening to the team today, I sort of visualize that the millennials, the Generation Zs are going to tend to push a lot harder and say, well, if you can't give me more ESG in the portfolio, what about putting these portfolios on the member choice platform? Because that's where my sort of values, my belief system is sort of leading towards. So I see these boards having a lot of discussion around MIC, member investment choice, around these kind of portfolios into the future.
Okay. Rosa, can you expand what Craig is talking about in terms of appetite and also what the costs around implementing ESG are?
Yes, so in terms of implementation, there are various ways of implementing, as Craig mentioned. I think you get some very sophisticated investors who are quite far down the line. They're considering a lot of different aspects, and the larger funds find it a lot easier to do. Smaller funds are struggling a lot. Lately, we started seeing a lot of ESG-type ETFs coming into the market. So, as considered a kind of easy way for smaller funds to dip their toe in it and also, get some ESG exposure in an easy and potentially cheap format. Cost-wise, again, a lot, and I think Mark mentioned this, a lot of the ESG is accessed through private markets. So the cost can vary there. You can get quite high costs, but you should then see fairly good impact as well as better returns. And then you've got, other solutions such as the ETFs. There are also things like green bonds that have recently been issued in South Africa, and clients can then start accessing those things through portfolios with fixed income that have those types of impacts included.
Rosia's talking about the different investments and what's to come in the future. Alex, I know part of your presentation is about the perceived trust deficit between the people and government. How do you believe that can be addressed in order to implement some of the ideas that we've heard today and that have been put forward?
Well, I think so trust really means that it's built through processes. And the processes that build trust involve what you do. Because if you basically act with a sort of a malicious purpose and it's obvious, or you do things that are obviously in your own interests, then it becomes very difficult to trust the process. So I think the problem that we have, it's a problem, but you essentially need processes to be set up by governments that need to be designed with the idea of building trust in them. We haven't done that. We've designed processes in which people do not trust them from the beginning. They're adversarial, and then they're interest-driven. And then they're seen as elitist, and nobody trusts them. Now, if we look at what we've had in the elections yesterday, I think it's a real concern that you've seen a substantial portion of South Africa's population didn't vote. And what that means is that they don't trust society in South Africa. They don't trust government. They don't trust private sector, they don't trust anybody, and they don't have an investment in South Africa. So the processes that we have developed from now on major government policy need to involve essentially giving away a certain degree of autonomy to processes to form policy, which engage a range of stakeholders with a range of interests in solving problems on together, rather than you co-produce solutions. We're not doing that at the moment. And just to finalize on that, we have to move away from policy which involves presenting a green paper for people to comment on in 4 months and saying that's a policy process.
Okay, I just want to bring, my apologies, I just want to bring Mark in as we wrap up. We've got 5 minutes to go. Mark, I'm just checking that you can still hear us, 1. And 2, is the international experience that returns are reduced when implementing ESG internationally?
Look, as I think I've said in the presentation there, the experience really hasn't played out. And so we won't see the impact of these policies on returns for quite some time. But certainly we've seen that investors are more willing to believe that their portfolios are not going to be worse off for having implemented ESG. So certainly in the last year, ESG has been, performing really quite well. So ESG funds have been performing above their sort of regular benchmarks. And the question is whether or not that's sustainable. But yeah, the market has moved towards embracing ESG and considering it to actually be a tailwind for performance. So I think that's just as implementation, adoption and maturity takes hold, that is starting to be the case. But I think the real test for all of this is really when we get a significant downturn in markets and a correction, and we'll see how things perform then. But at the moment it looks quite positive.
All right, Natasha, I want to come back to an issue that you raised a little bit earlier on around that now withdrawn green paper. What work is the Actuarial Society doing to analyze the issues that were raised in that paper?
So as I said, we really are trying to get to a place where we can unpack what we've got and then put a roadmap in place. So, for example, there's no point in starting with a contribution of 12%. Perhaps we need to start with a lower contribution, which is a top-up over and above, institutional contributions. Those kind of things, so that it to Alex's point, it creates trust. I can see with my 1% it's working, okay, I'm happy to go to 2%. And the kind of policy framework which you want to avoid is that people or employers deformalize their employment. So, for example, if you put in place a policy that says, if you've got it doesn't apply for employers with less than 5 employees, so that your company that takes its 50 employees and breaks it up into 10 small companies of 5, so that it doesn't have to implement. So you want you want your policies to be robust and sound to avoid that deformalization of your economy. You want to try and make it more formal and bring more and more people into the system.
Mm-hmm. Craig, when you started, you spoke about how good it was to see people in the room, and we know that COVID has affected almost every aspect of our life. Talk to us about the effect of COVID on contributions being paid to retirement funds.
COVID, if you actually just rewind 18 months back and looked at our lives almost lying ahead, and you look at it today, how the landscape has changed. Beginning of last year, we came in there, and thanks to the FSCA, they looked at the industry and said, let's understand from a retirement funds perspective, how do we help the members in these kind of hardship times? And they allowed funds to amend their rules, to be able to reduce their contribution rates, to ultimately take more take-home pay for the individuals to take them through this hardship. And from our side of things, we did some data analytics, NMG being an insights business, we did some data analytics across our database, and what we found is that the contribution rate, the gross contribution rate was coming towards the fund was around about 12.7% in 2019, and when we did the analysis now in 2021, we found that that number had dropped down to 11.65%. So what you're finding is that within the fund's rules, the employers have got multiple contribution categories. People were stepping down their contributions to take more money home, which then talks to the bigger picture effect that now you've made that worsening gap of your retirement benefit ultimately when you leave the fund.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's go back to Mark. Are ESG portfolios typically through private markets or listed markets internationally? That's my first question. And my second question is, can you leave us with final thoughts as we are wrapping up the discussion?
Yeah, sure. Look, for the most part, ESG begins in equity portfolios, right? So that becomes the easiest place to begin your journey. And I think Raza mentioned that the ETFs become an easy access point or a structure to implement those policies in order to test and learn. But where we're seeing, so if you think about the range of asset owners from a maturity perspective or sophistication when it comes to ESG, the more sophisticated asset owners who generally do have private market exposures are moving those ESG policies into private markets. So that's becoming an increasing focus, and particularly as the market moves to what is termed impact investing, then that impact investing is mainly observable in private markets because you can put capital play in a more targeted manner, observe the impact and influence your general partner, for example. So yeah, that's that question. And then my final remark would be that I think some elements here of trust have been raised, and I think those are particularly good ones. I think that overall, I would say that I don't believe asset owners or managers generally have done a particularly good job articulating what they do and how they do it to constituencies that they serve. And so some of doing that better is one way of building trust. And I think that another way of doing that is by implementing sensible ESG policies and being sure that you're ahead of that, because that will help build trust amongst particular constituencies.
All right, so we're going to do a final round. I'm going to ask you one final question and then ask you to also leave us with your final thoughts. Alex, first I'll start with you. Do you believe that there would be an opt-out option in the proposed retirement reform structure? And then also leave us with your final thoughts.
In any social security system, where you're dealing with any kind of pooling or cross-subsidization, you typically don't create an opt-out of the cross-subsidization, but you can opt out of the organization you're participating in. Mm-hmm. So the issue is to be able to separate out that participation from the issue of the pooling and redistribution parts. But I think that the debates going forward, to sort of conclude, I think that there's a big discussion to be had. I think that where people are and envisioning a future is all over the place. And I think that it would actually help if the conversation began to kind of look at what the real options are. And maybe if I give one approach, is that you do want to solve the big problems first. And the question is, are those problems institutional or are they about the contribution level? The contribution level comes at the end of an institutional design. We are nowhere close to actually talking about contributions. We have to talk about institutions, organizations that we set up to solve certain problems. And so we need to sort out that first. So the question is, do we have agreement on what are the first big problems we have to solve? Can we get to that point? Because what one's looking at is 20 years of continuous incremental reform, which we're not taking even the first step. And so we need to kind of work out what the first steps are.
Natasha, what are the considerations around unit pricing of ESG portfolios in South Africa, and your final thoughts, please?
Thank you. Yes, so unitizing obviously of a normal product is fine, but long-term environmental, a wind farm or a dam or those kind of things that are built are more difficult to unitize. But I think fortunately we've now got systems and ways that we can transfer those assets from members that are leaving to members that are staying, and you can then kind of still unitize them daily with a projected system. So it is possible to do, and which is why, compared to 20 years ago, more and more funds are willing to take it up. Those practical challenges have been overcome. And yeah, as a concluding remark, I think I'm hopeful that we can start the conversations that we need to have. I'm hopeful that the small changes can be made, and for example, the changes that have been thought about the two-bucket system. That's something which can help people to access savings and still get some long-term savings. So I'm hopeful it will get somewhere.
Thank you. Craig, what replacement ratios are clients looking at, and your final thoughts?
Yeah, and I needed an hour for this one. It's something that I really feel passionate about. So if you just look at Treasury's paper, where you see that 6% of our population can retire comfortably in South Africa, it is a very scary thought. When we did the data analytics on our own fund, we found that the average replacement ratio had actually gone down from about 35% down to about 32%. So what that means is that it's 32% of your final salary is what's available to buy yourself a pension one day. So that's actually quite a scary thought in terms of you've been working for X number of years and this is the pension that you're going to be purchasing one day. So for me, my thought process around this one would be, whilst Alex was talking about the incremental reform process that you're going to go through, is about there should be sort of a parallel process of how we actually educate individuals out there in terms of all these big concepts of savings, investing, not taking your money out of the system, and to ensure that you don't become part of the statistic that you're earning 35% of your salary at retirement. So I think for me that would be the biggest driver in the next coming years, in parallel to the process that the environment will be going through, the country will be going through.
Okay, final thoughts? Craig, that's your final thoughts?
That's my final
answer.
Okay.
All right, Razia, can you expect to give up returns when implementing ESG in South Africa, especially in the context that's been touched on throughout the seminar about that perhaps trust deficit and more?
So I mean, as Mark mentioned, we're not expecting ESG actually to reduce returns at all. And I think one of the things that we need to start thinking about and thinking about positively is if we're looking at sustainable returns, in other words, we're not investing just for the short term, but for the long term in companies that will be there for the future, then naturally we do expect returns to be better over the longer term. Final thoughts from me, I think ESG is a very important concept. It touches on retirement reform in terms of the social aspect, and we need a lot of that improvement locally. But also, ESG can become a really big existential crisis for us from a climate change perspective, and people actually do need to start taking it very, very seriously. I think I would encourage everyone to start thinking about it now. We need to start doing something. Even if it's something small, it can make a difference over the long term. And, we don't need to wait for a perfect system. Good enough will work for now.
Okay.
So.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists for giving us their different points of view, both globally and locally on ESG and more. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to learn and spend time with you today. Thank you so much.